cybersecurity and privacy team. He has assisted clients in the negotiation and preparation of privacy policies, notices, and other documentation designed to comply with both general privacy principles and sector-based laws, particularly with HIPAA, high-tech, and FERPA for family education rights. He's well-versed in incident investigation and breach response, including breach notification requirements in the U.S. and abroad, and generally assisting clients in staying ahead of cybersecurity risks. He's also familiar with cyber insurance policies and various coverage issues that can arise under them. He has received his Certified Information Privacy Professional, CIPP-US, designation from the International Association of Privacy Professionals. And unfortunately, Eddie Block is not going to be able to join us today. He had a last-minute conflict. So I'll go on and introduce myself. Peter Vogel, as I mentioned earlier, and I am a trial partner at Gardere Wynn, but before studying law, had a career as a computer programmer, have a master's in computer science, and at Gardere, I'm chair of our Internet, e-commerce and technology group, and the co-chair of our cybersecurity and privacy policy. My law practice is limited to IT disputes and e-commerce services, and also I negotiate contracts in those spaces. For 30 years, I served as an adjunct professor at the SMU Dedman School of Law, and including of which 15 years teaching the law of e-commerce. So today, let's talk about blockchain. And I guess the truth about this from the standpoint of what are we talking about, this actually is not very new, although I think it's now getting some traction. It has been around for about 20 years, actually, almost 20 years. But I think what kind of made this develop is the advent of the currency Bitcoin. And Eric, I know that just from the standpoint of our clients and what's going on in the world, the importance of knowing and understanding Bitcoin has become even more important, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, and it's, excuse me, it's trying to, I mean, I think Bitcoin started out as sort of a novelty, a novelty currency experiment, but it's become something a lot more than that, particularly as people try and use Bitcoin for larger transactions as assets that can be secured or unsecured, or that can be pledged in the course of a deal. And it's, in that respect, it's created a lot of legal issues, even though it's supposed to be unregulated or regulated by the internet itself. It still does create legal issues in and of itself. But well, yeah, it's becoming a bigger player for sure.
Yeah, and I think the important part, and certainly from the audience's perspective, is blockchain's been around for 20 years. Bitcoin has not. And so I think it's how has the use of the technology that's been around since about 1996, how has that been implemented? And I think blockchain is what we're really going to talk about today. Bitcoin just happens to be the high visibility use of it in today's world. So let's talk about generally what is Bitcoin. And by this kind of definition, if nothing else, it is a decentralized means to keep up with data that is very different. So we're going to sort of talk through how blockchain actually operates here for a few minutes before we talk about kind of some of these industry issues. Starting with the fact that there is a database where financial, personal identifiable information, contracts, anything can be stored, and it is controlled in a very different way than if you think about the old classic database where different companies and different individuals have access. And it's also distributed in a very different way, but the cryptographic issue, including the public key, is very important, and we're going to obviously talk more about that. So do we look at it in kind of a simplistic perspective is, in a way, it's not a whole lot more than just a spreadsheet. And I think that how we keep up with it and how the data is transmitted and managed on it creates a different circumstance than when we did things in paper to begin with. And certainly trying to validate and keep the information in a method where the data is actually trustworthy. And I think that's exactly the whole point. Wouldn't you agree, Eric, about using the Bitcoin example, about the assurance that the currency is for real, because one of the dynamic realities of looking at Bitcoin is it is a monetary system that is not regulated by a government or a banking system.
It's not a currency. I mean, it's a digital currency, but it's not money in the same way you would define money. And like you said, because it's not regulated by any one government, it can't be considered money under different, like Article 9 of the UCC, defines money in a certain way, so it can't be classified like that. And I'm sure you're going to get into the double payment issue too. The idea that because it's not regulated, the big fear with Bitcoin early on was, well, how do I know you have that money? And the whole idea of a digital currency seemed very skeptical at the very beginning.
Well, I think some people were, but at the end of the day, what we're talking about is, and why this is different based on the comment you just made, is there is no central authority. And I think that's how we go about making sure that in a Bitcoin setting that the money is being transferred, but if it's in any other business setting, whether it's healthcare or music or something else, how do we make sure that we can really validate the information and how it's managed? Well, the way we do that is everything is created in a block, and that data sits in the block for a certain length of time, and then it's transmitted and broadcast to the different nodes in the system. And then at some point, there's a validation that that transaction has occurred, and then it's added to a chain. And so then the block is locked down. And once you have the data locked in a block, it's automatically, you create a history of, in this case, currency. You have a history of all the monies that have been spent in Bitcoin. You have a history, you can look back at the history to validate that the data is correct. And then what happens is there is a way to validate that process where you have people that are mining the data to help validate. And if they find a particular block that has been added properly, and this goes on all the time, there are people mining all over the world to try and find this, they get Bitcoins if they find the block and validate it. So it allows for, as you pointed out earlier, it allows for a circumstance like this where you have chains of information. In the first example, where you have a valid transfer, where you have Alice transferring $5 to Bob, and then $5 to Cindy, and then Bob transfers to Cindy, and then Cindy transfers to Eddie, that all works fine. But then if you look at you trying to do a double spend, it will not allow that to happen. And I think that part of that validation of having the independent data is kind of what we look at as to be important. So how does this apply in the law that I think we need to be concerned about? And that is one of the issues that I think is paramount in the whole blockchain space is smart contracts. I think we live in a time today where, as I've gone around the country taking an informal poll, that I would say less than 1% of the population reads terms of service or click agreements or privacy policies. And so we're now at a point where in the blockchain world, we are all agreeing contractually to whatever those terms are. And there is a kind of a world that has developed around this, referring to as smart contracts, but it also puts a burden on us to make sure that those are the contracts are right and justifiable. But I think we haven't seen much testing them, except for the attempted fraud and bankruptcies and things with Bitcoin. But we really haven't seen much with this yet. I think we will, don't you?
Well, I think, when you realize that, enforcement of these contracts, whatever provisions you agreed to, whether you've read them or not, once you've agreed to them, the whole point of doing it this way is to automatically enforce the provisions. So, when you violate a term of the provision, even if you didn't know you violated it, the response has already been processed, as it were. So you whatever penalties accrue to you breaching the contract will have already happened, if that makes sense. So there's, yeah, you're right. There's no room after the fact for negotiating when you put this process into place. So it does put a greater burden on the consumer, assuming that's something that the consumer wants to do, is to be able to say, right, well, I can't agree to those terms. And again, it depends on what we're talking about, but things like transactions that are more personal and more negotiable, you're going to want to make sure you understand that, because enforcement becomes a lot more seamless when you don't,
But it is kind of cooked in, and I think that's the point, that it is cooked into blockchain. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, the public key infrastructure. This is not new either. Digital certificates have been around for, at least the past 20 years. And I think what's happened is that the whole point of the PKI historically has been where you would give the other party to a transaction one of these keys so that they could unlock and access the data. But in the blockchain world, this has become even more important, because you need to validate that the person getting the value of the either Bitcoin or the resources that they're transferring, that they are who they claim to be. And so this is very important. And so the structure that's included in the Wikipedia design here talks about how the holder of the key in the lower left-hand corner gives or passes this along electronically, so that that person can share the money, and the banking system, in this instance, in buying clothes, allows for the transaction to validate that that person really has the money. And I think it's really important. But the other part that I think we need to look at, and that is, or another facet of this, is who uses Bitcoin today. This is not just something that is going on between people outside of the normal course of our business. I kind of selectively picked a group of pretty well-known companies and organizations that use Bitcoin and accept it. And to me, one that kind of jumped off the page here to me was Tesla. I find that kind of interesting, given all things different about the electronic automobile, that would be there. But having Dell and 1-800-Flowers, I think it's interesting. But then Virgin Galactica is also here. So, and of course, there are many more. These were ones that I thought that the audience would appreciate.
Right. And I mean, as I said earlier on, the idea is that I think there are people out there that want Bitcoin to become even bigger, in the sense of, not only do I want to be able to use Bitcoin to buy things or to sell things, but I want to be able to pledge Bitcoin as an asset in a transaction. I want Bitcoin to be a collateral, a piece of collateral. We're talking large amounts of Bitcoin here. And that hasn't caught on quite as much, because there are fears that, although Bitcoin can tell you, yes, Bob has the 500,000 Bitcoins in his account, it doesn't tell you whether those Bitcoins have been encumbered in any way by any other, a lien, if you will, on the Bitcoins. And so I think part of what they're trying to work out is for this to become a much more corporate type of endeavor, that rules governing how much of the information about the Bitcoin you can see. Well, can you see who's got a lien on the Bitcoins, and what happens to that lien when it gets transferred to the new owner? Does the lien stay or does it go? And so that's why, yes, it's catching on, but it's not catching on in the same way with the sort of larger transactions, because of that fear.
Well, if we go back in the mid-90s, when the internet was really taking off, there were different economic tools that never caught on, because people started using credit cards. So this is probably where we are going to end up. Of course, going forward, it's kind of debatable exactly where we're going. And I think this headline caught my attention in January 2017, where we have the Federal Drug Administration signing an agreement with IBM to use Watson and blockchain to manage electronic medical records here. So what, you do a lot in healthcare. So what's the message here, you think, that the federal government is getting into this?
Well, and I think, there are obviously huge benefits to the digitization of health records, in the sense of being able to affect public health or do research. And so I think part of the efforts that the FDA are undergoing is to be able to seamlessly, with consent, of course. I mean, there are still issues regarding patient consent, even with blockchain in its use in the healthcare field. To be able for researchers to, have a this network that they can access this data from and pull that information in. At least the FDA's opinion is that it's going to improve public health. It's going to make initiatives that the government would want to sponsor in terms of public health more accessible. It's going to allow for more patient input, because that's what when they talk about the Internet of Things, imagine you as the patient are hooked into this blockchain this network of nodes, and you can use your Fitbit to input information on your heart rate or on your pulse ox rate or something like that, and that information can then be used in research down the line.
Well, and I think this is exciting information to see that the government is hooking up with Watson, the artificial intelligence tools of IBM. But also we're seeing the banking industry getting involved in this, and I think that's particularly interesting, that even though Bitcoin is another monetary system, that the regular banking system is interested in this as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, wire transfers are one of the big areas. So they're looking for a way to make wire transfers more seamless. Now, again, that it hasn't caught on quite as much as it could yet now because of the UCC issues with wire transfers, and when does as the transfer, when does your obligation stop, and when does the next person's begin? And blockchain tries to address some of those issues, but the definitions don't quite match up yet. So it's going to involve, I think, some state legislating as well of definitions under the UCC to make sure that these types of transactions are covered in the same way, and people feel as protected as they would under a normal situation.
Right, and you brought up the Uniform Commercial Code, and obviously, since it is the law of commerce in the United States, I think it's interesting to see that there are new rules around blockchain in the banking Article 4, which is the banking law of the United States. And so I think that's an interesting sign. And then you and I noted earlier this year in 2017 that Arizona passed a law dealing with blockchain and how it affects the UCC.
Yeah, and I mean, it was odd. I mean, it seemed to only affect Article 2A, and which are sales and leases, and Article 7, which I'm pretty sure is the certificates of title, warehouse transfers, and things like that. So maybe it'll start applying to other things as well. But basically the gist of the law was, if it's covered, and just because it's blockchain doesn't change the nature of the coverage under the UCC. And I mean, it adds a few definitions as well, as if to say, look, we support this type of technology. We don't want anybody thinking that just because you're doing it through blockchain, somehow that has, made the sale less legally binding, if you will.
Well, and I think we're going to see a trend on this as we are in intellectual property, as we have the Department of Commerce looking at copyright laws associated with blockchain, and then also patent trolls. This is something that, has been a huge issue. As a matter of fact, as we speak, Congress is mulling over what to do with patent trolls and how to deal with the ownership interest. But I think that the whole idea that there is something going on with blockchain in dealing with intellectual property is an interesting thought all by itself, because then you don't have the international borders to deal with, and you can have better security of protecting copyrights and trademarks and patents. It's just a very different model than having all these treaties around the world that try and connect with one another. And then another issue that is being considered, NASDAQ is looking at this as whether or not we might use blockchain to have electronic voting, because this is something that is clearly an issue that goes on around the world. People are very skeptical of allowing voting on the internet, but if we use blockchain, that may change things. So where we're going in the future, which is what I think many of the people listening in today probably are interested in trying to figure out too, and that is, if we can validate title transfer of real estate or ownership of music or sports entertainment, that's a different model than we have now, because we could lose rights. And I think from a legal standpoint, we're going to see a great deal of change going forward in these areas. And I think this is the kind of the commerce of 2017 in the future about what we need to be doing.
Yeah, well, and I mean, the final word of caution, of course, is that as I said before, privacy concerns don't go away with blockchain, even with what they call permissive blockchain, which is blockchain that obviously requires certain access controls and for you to be able to access the nodes of the network. So it is going to, for anybody interested in sort of looking into the technology and finding a way to apply it, you're still going to have to deal with the issues of security of the information. It's harder to hack, and it's certainly you can't change the information. You might be able to look at it though, and if that's a concern, especially in the healthcare field, you're going to want to make sure that you've protected, done your due diligence in terms of privacy compliance.
Well, and I think the bottom line on it is that the blockchain privacy gives more assurance of the security of the data. So we're thankful that you were able to join us today, and we certainly welcome emails and calling us if you have any questions about blockchain legal issues. I have a feeling, because this is kind of in a development stage, that we will revisit this again on another webinar in the future. So thanks very much for joining us today, and please let us know if you have any questions. Thanks.